Hello and welcome back to another video. In this episode, we're diving the Tairua Bar in search of fishing and diving gear from boats that have been flipping recently. Over the past 2 weeks, there have been 3 separate boats that have flipped on the bar. Gearing up at the Mount Paku wharf, conditions were looking great. The water was looking very clear, relatively speaking of course. The tide is mid-outgoing, so at a minimum, I would have to be out for 3 hours if I were to come back through the channel again. The currents are very strong here, and fighting against the tides is near impossible at times, especially during big tides such as they were this day. Outside of the sanctuary of the harbour, conditions were quite different. There was quite a lot of chop building as well as a rolling swell. Here is a piece from a boat that flipped on the bar. When diving in swelly conditions, you need to remain vigilant about where the rocks are. You don't want to end up too close and getting dropped on top of one by a wave. In dirty water this is hard, as it can be very disorientating at times. But it's important to put your head above the surface and have a look around, and make mental note of where the rocks are. Have a look for swell and white water. Cray pots are a lazy way to catch crayfish. However, you can have a look inside them to gauge what the area is like, see if it's holding other crayfish. This one had no bait and no crays. Diving in murky water can be quite uncomfortable at times. However, it's always better than sitting at home watching TV or something. Swimming along, I saw a rope leading down to the bottom, so I followed it. It had no buoy attached, and at the bottom of the rope I found a cray pot. It looked like it had been here for some time. Eventually I worked up the courage to venture out into some deeper water. I was greeted with relatively clear water on the surface. However, diving down, I think I'm seeing the bottom, some sand here, but as I get into it, it's just a layer of filth and silt. So I go up to the surface and decide probably going to spend the rest of this dive in the shallows, because that's pretty scary. By this point I'd given up on trying to find boat bits and pieces of gear. It was just too murky to be able to do any decent searching. Despite the conditions, it was overall unsurprising, considering the fact there has been a tsunami as well as cyclone swell. This is the first actually diveable day we've had in quite a while. This time around I'm using a polespear, the Atlantis PS2 2-piece polespear, 9 foot long. I've done a few of my own modifications to it. Oh, hello, there's a butterfish. Hopefully it comes back around to say hi. Using a 9 foot long polespear in such limited water visibility makes it very hard to maneuver. You need the fish to swim out in front of you or you don't stand a chance. This area was also holding quite a few juvenile porori that were hanging out in small schools feeding on the kelp. I've always found the butterfish around Mount Paku to be quite spooky. Very skittish compared to butterfish you'll find in other places. I believe this is due to the high population density of sharks in the area. In my own personal experience, bronze whaler sharks have always been pretty drawn to butterfish that I've shot. Here is a golden opportunity, a butterfish passing straight out in front of me, spooking at the last possible moment before I release. Even when you spook a fish and it heads off, it can pay to stay on the bottom as other fish may come in. I've heard some people say that fish will move out to deeper water if there's strong onshore swell. And what I saw this day correlates with that. A lot of small residential fish hang out on the reef. This day I saw nothing that you could classify as a pelagic fish. No kingfish, no mackerel, no kahawai, no trevally. However, juvenile blue maumau always make for cool diving. You can differentiate them from sweet, which they are commonly misidentified as, by the yellow toning on the underside of their body. Fish identification is a key skill in spearfishing. You don't want to shoot things if you don't know what they are. In New Zealand waters there are numerous protected species, things that are no-take species, as well as size and limit regulations. While surfacing here I can see quite a big set has come through, causing a lot of white water on the surface as well as rushing currents. I'm going to get away from the rocks so I don't get bashed up against them. Luckily they were pushing me inshore and away from anything I could potentially injure myself on. When you're diving in swelly conditions, it often pays to have an escape plan for when you make it to the surface and conditions aren't great. In the Coromandel, porori are one of the most common inshore fish species. They are well adapted to living in shallow water close to shore, often in estuaries and brackish water. They are vegetarian fish that feed on green plant matter growing in the water. In New Zealand, there is no minimum size limit for porori. They're generally quite large fish, typically 35 to 40 centimeters. These ones were just juveniles. However, I was trying to take the polespear for a spin and get something for a feed. This one here looked pretty tasty and I got it into him. Shooting fish with a polespear is always very rewarding, even if it's just a small porori like this one. When using a polespear, you typically have to get a lot closer to the fish that you're targeting. You don't have the same range you do on a spear gun, you're very limited. As well as that, a polespear is typically going to be longer, making it harder to maneuver through the water. However, it does come with numerous advantages. It's cheaper, easier to use, and a lot quicker to reload. Often if you shoot at a fish and miss on your spear gun, you've lost your opportunity. But with this polespear, you can reload and get back into the action a lot quicker. Bleeding and gutting your fish will ensure top eating quality, as well as meaning you can store it for a lot longer. The contents inside the gut and the internal organs are often the first things to break down, as well as the blood. That's where most of the fishy smell comes from initially. Fresh fish that has been well looked after has virtually no smell to it. This is what you should always be aiming for. At this point I'm ready to wrap things up, but the tide hasn't turned yet, so I'm going to have to improvise and go up mountain pack and walk down to my car instead. Alright, so that didn't go how I planned. Wasn't very successful that dive. You win some, you lose some. It's good to be out there anyway, getting wet, out there doing it in the ocean. Even managed to come away with a nice little porori at the end of it. How's that for a monster? Probably 20, maybe 15 pounds at a minimum. But yeah, pretty happy with that one. Sometimes I crack myself up with the situations that I willingly put myself in. I knew getting up the mountain would be an undertaking, but it's always more than I remember it being. At least now that I'm out of the water, I can actually see where I'm going. Before getting out, I was tossing up between two options. One, going up the mountain and walking down to my car, which I decided to follow through on, and two, going to the main beach and going through the surf, getting onto the beach itself and then walking to my car. I opted for the first option. I felt like the waves would be a lot harder to manage on the beach, but here there was a nice little bay that I could kind of get out and suss my shit. I do enjoy the occasional rock climb, however things are a lot less leisurable when you're holding a float boat in one hand and a GoPro in the other. Life is about the journey, not the destination. Going through experiences like this that are challenging mentally, physically and emotionally makes you appreciate the good times a lot more. Next time I'm out diving in clean water, not having to walk up a mountain and swimming against gnarly current, I'm going to be a lot more grateful than if I hadn't had some of the experience I've had in the past couple of dives. This is another one of those ones where I'm glad I did it, but I wouldn't do it again. Fortunately, there are many spectacular views in the walk, making it for the most part worth it. Personally, I love a shore dive mission. I feel like you miss out on a lot if you just dive off boats. By this point I was sick of carrying all my dive gear, so I hid it in this bush, hoping that when I come back later, it's all there exactly where I left it. Getting my wetsuit jacket off, I put a gnarly hole in it. Easily the worst wetsuit hole I've ever done. However, it's a good excuse to buy a new one. Under the beating summer sun, concrete can get very hot. On bare feet, it can be almost unbearable. Jumping over dark bits of tarmac, I eventually start making my way down the mountain. I absolutely love living in Tyra. This place is home to me. And look at that. Beautiful area, beautiful part of the country, and I'm glad to be here. And I am also glad to be down the mountain finally, and towards my car. So happy I could almost hug it. Or maybe even chuck a couple cheeky fingers up in the exhaust pipe. Having a car is an important piece of dive kit. It means you can get to spots, get all your gear there, and get back without having to miss super hard. Ice creams are an essential summer snack, and with staff rates at Dutchies, it's hard to resist sometimes. Getting back to my little stash, all my gear is still there, and I'm very stoked as you'll soon see. Thank you very much for watching this video. This episode's sustainability message is: reduce the amount of fish that you waste.